We're now going to have a look at enumerations, or enums as they're more commonly referred to as, and these were introduced in PHP 8.1, and what they do is they provide a way to define a fixed set of possible values. What do I mean by that? If we think of something like cardinal directions, there is only north, east, south and west. They are a fixed set of possible values, and so that is what enums helps us achieve. And so no random rogue values get into there. There will only ever be that fixed set. And so I think the way we'll attack this is we'll first start out with a little example and show how that can be improved by using enums instead of things like integers. If you like this lesson, then you'll love my object-oriented PHP course, which covers a lot of the stuff that you'll see in this video, such as composition, type hinting and serialization, as well as all the essentials of object-oriented programming in PHP. It's definitely going to help you, so I'll leave a link in the description and at the end of the video. So here I have a response class, and these are the three constructor parameters. So we have string for content, we have an integer for status code, and we have an array for headers. So the content, as long as it's a string, that could be anything. Same for headers, we could have lots and lots of headers. However, the interesting one here is status code, because there are a fixed number of status codes. There's about 60 different HTTP status codes, and they are represented with an integer. For example, the integer 200 means OK, 201 means that a resource has been created, and so you get the idea there. But what we'd like to do is make it strict, because at the moment we are just type hinting an integer here, which means that we could pass integers which aren't actually one of those status codes. So first off, let's just go happy path and run with this. We'll pass a status code which is allowed, and then we'll start to have a little think about, well, what can we actually do about when we get status codes which are not allowed? Okay, so one possible solution is to use constants, and you'll see this quite commonly in use for this kind of thing. If you look at like response and request classes which are currently in circulation out there in the PHP world, then you'll see that constants are used quite widely for this kind of thing. So for example, if we want a HTTP OK status code, which will be 200, you can have a constant like this. And then when we go to instantiate a response, then we can just use that constant like so. So there we've created a response, and this HTTP OK will evaluate to 200. So we're doing the same thing as this, except instead of just passing in some arbitrary number, we know that if we actually use the constants on the class, then we are going to pass something which is valid. However, the problem does still exist, because even though we are using constants, there's still nothing which will stop someone from just saying whatever, just making up some random number, or for some way for a invalid number to be passed into the response by your system. And so you could add a validation to your response class, which would probably involve adding all of these to an array and checking, or having some kind of validation method which will check if the response code which has been passed is in the array, the allowed list of response codes. But now that we have enums, we can do things a much cleaner way than that, because they will already do your checking for you. So let's go ahead and create one. I'm just going to do it in the same file, and we're going to move these files out here eventually, but for the time being, let's just work in here. So the way that you create an enum is you use the keyword enum, and then you need to give this a name. So here we are dealing with HTTP status codes, so we shall call it HTTP status code, and then I'll drop my curly braces onto a new line. And the way that you add the values to these is you use the case keyword. And so, for example, in the case where we have a HTTP OK, we can just say case OK, like so. Okay, so what we're creating at the moment is something called a pure enum. So you'll notice that this doesn't have a value. It is holding the value 200. We're going to get to that in a second when we look at backed enums. But first, let's just go ahead and create a pure enum. So this is how I finished it off. I've just added in some common HTTP scenarios here: created, bad request, forbidden, large headers, internal server error. So this is okay, but for our case, we'd really like to have that code. In order to do that, we need to create something called a backed enum, which means you are backing each case with a value. And so let's go in and actually add some values. The way you can do this is you say equals, and there I'm putting 200 for OK, and you'll notice I'm getting a squiggly red line. An important thing about backed enums, or a couple of important things, is you need to specify what type of values you are using, and we're using integers. You can only have a choice of two. They need to be either an integer or a string. There are no other types which are allowed. So here we're going to say integer, and then once you do that, every single one has to be an integer. You can't combine ints and strings. So doing something like this, int string, or if I can spell it right, int string, you can't have union types. It needs to be one or the other. Very strict about this. And that's the thing with enums. The whole point of them is so that you are supplying only valid values. And so we're giving a stronger type and a meaning to parameters when we pass these things in. Okay, so now each of our cases has a value. We can actually go ahead and use this in our response. And so instead of passing an integer now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pass an enum, or I'm going to pass the HTTP status code. Okay, so that is now the type which our response expects. And so, for example, if we want to pass the OK status code, the way that we would do that will be like this: HTTP status code OK. I'm just going to delete this one now. We don't need that anymore. Now that we've done this, though, you might be thinking, well, how do we actually get at that 200 value on our HTTP OK status code? And the answer is there is actually a built-in property on enums, or on backed enums, called value. So let's have a go at retrieving that, and we'll do it in a fairly realistic way. So it's probably something you're going to want to retrieve inside of this response class. So let's add a public function, and we'll call it get. We'll not say status code. That might be misleading, because you might think, well, we're going to return an enum from that. We'll say get status code value, just to be explicit, and we know that this should be an integer. And we do have type safety there, and we can say that we know that this will be an integer because we have this type hinted here, and these values can only be integers. Sorry if that was really obvious, but sometimes you just never know. Okay, so what we're going to do is return from this. We'll say this status code, and you'll notice PHP Storm is giving me some auto completion. I've got a choice of two things here, and one of those is value. And so we're just going to select that, and then let's go and test this out. So here we shall just echo response, get status code value, just going to put a new line on the end of there, and let's go and actually run this. So PHP Enums, and as you can see, we get a value of 200. Now, sometimes you might want to have a little bit more information, or you might want your enum to help you with a little bit more information. For example, if we look at these here, large headers, is that really explaining what the error is to a human? That doesn't really mean a lot to me in its current state. And so what you can do is you can add methods to enums. Very important though, you can add methods, but you cannot add properties. So you get the built-in properties such as value and name, which you've just seen, but you can't add your own because enums, they have to be stateless. So let's go and add a method here, and we'll just call it getMessage. In fact, I'm just going to call it message, and this will return a string, and we can use match here. So say, for example, we want to get a message for OK by using match like this. So we can say return match, and then this, and then we can have a message for each of these cases. So here, let's go with self OK, and this is the match syntax, uses the double arrow, and for this we'll just say success. And then for each of these, you can just create a message in the same way. And that is what I've done here. And so let's go and try this out. Just take one last look at the syntax before we do this. So I've just created a public function message. We're expecting this to return a string because we're creating a message for each of these cases. And we can define those. We can say self, or we could have used HTTP status code, but we'll stick with self. And then down at the bottom here, just going to remove some of this now. So we'll say status code, because you can store them in variables just like anything else. Status code equals HTTP status code, and we'll go with the one that we used for the example, large headers, and then we shall just say echo status code message. And we'll put a new line on the end of there. Okay, we'll go and run this, PHP Enums, and there we get the message, request header fields too large. And you can create methods for whatever you see fit. It's not just for stuff like this where you're using match. Whatever you think might help you use the information which the enum is containing. But one thing I will say is that this is quite a common way to use this, and you might see this used quite a lot. Alright, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you some methods which we have available on Enums. Before I do that though, I think I'm just going to initialize Composer. The way I'm going to do it though is I'm just going to pull in a package. So Symfony require -- dev, and we'll go with Symfony var dumper. And this will just help me display things. Also, I'll get Composer's autoloader because I'm going to show you also that enums can be namespace just like classes or anything else. Okay, so at the top here, let's just require once. We'll go with vendor autoload. And then I'll show you a method called cases. So we'll store it in a variable, cases equals, and we'll say HTTP status code cases, and then we'll just do dd cases, and we'll go and run this again. And so here you can see we get an array containing all of our cases. You notice the curly brackets around each one. Basically that is telling us that each case here is an object. And so an interesting thing to note is that not only is each case an object, it's also a singleton object. In other words, you can't have two of the same one floating around in your project. Let me demo that to help you make more sense of it. We'll just say code1 equals HTTP status code. Okay, copy that a couple of times. Code2 will be something else, bad request. But code 3 will be okay, and so we'll just compare these. So I'm just going to say dd, and if you remember how we compared objects, it was in one of the previous chapters. Just go and check that out. So dd code 1 equals code 2. If we look at this, we'll see that it's false because they are indeed different cases. But if we compare 1 against 3, you'll see both of those are HTTP status OK, which will evaluate to two objects, but two of the same object. Okay, and so that comes back as true. So the next thing I'll show you is from, and this is useful, for example, if you have a value 2 or 1, but you want to get the actual HTTP status code enum for that value. The way that you do that is like this. So we'll say code equals HTTP status code, and the method we are looking for is from, and we know that all of these are going to be integers, and so if we pass 201 and then if we dd on that code, as you can see we get HTTP status code created. So again, like I say, important to remember you are getting an object for this. In fact, if we go and dump out the type, so we'll say get type code, run this again, the type is object. Okay, so what about if I provide a code which doesn't exist, it isn't on our HTTP status code. So if I say 1, 2, 3, 4, let's see what happens this time. And this time we get an uncaught value error. 1234 is not a valid backing value for enum HTTP status code. So we get a fatal error for that if you look for 1234, but that isn't a valid value on this enum. Okay, there is one other, and that is try from, and what this does if it doesn't actually find that value is it will give you null instead of that. So let's go and run this. So instead of throwing that error out, this time we get null. And so if you're wondering which to use, from or try from, of course it all depends on your application and the surrounding code, but what I would probably do is default to using from and only use try from if I absolutely need it, if I have an application which is going to also deal with null, simply because it's just a little bit of extra protection. You're only dealing with one type instead of null and one other type. But like I say, all depends on the application, how the surrounding code has been written. Okay, so we obviously don't want to keep this stuff all in one file, and the enums, you treat them pretty much the same as classes and put them in their own files, or that is the best practice. So that's what we're going to do here. But first off, let's just go and create a new folder. So we'll create a folder called source src, and then inside of there we'll create one called http, where we'll add all our http related files. And then we're going to create one called HTTP status code. And I'm just going to take my enum, cut it from there and drop it into here. And I'm going to give this a namespace of app HTTP. Like so. So make sure you get your casing the same as mine. And then we'll create a response class. You'll notice the namespace is already done for me. So all I need to do is just go and grab this response class, cut that from there, drop it into there. And then next what we want to do is make our auto loading work. So over to composer.json, and here I'm just going to drop in a new entry. So this will be auto load. And then inside of there we want PSR for auto loading, and I want to map my app namespace to that source folder, that src folder. The way that we do this is we say app, and then you need your backslashes in there, 2 backslashes, and that will map to the source folder. And then we need to tell Composer to update its auto loading files, and we can do this with composer dump autoload. So composer dump autoload, or alternatively, a bit shorter, you can just do composer du, it'll do the same thing. Okay, so let's just go back to the enums file and check that this is working. Just clear some of this out of here. I'll say response equals new response. I'll import that. Content, we'll just make something up, that's not important. What is important is our status code, so we'll go with HTTP status code OK. Going to import that as well. And then headers, we'll just have an empty array. And then we'll test this out, we'll just say response, get status code value. Let's go and run this, PHP Enums. Okay, and we get 200. Let's change the code to something else. I think we had 403 forbidden. Let's go and run it again. Okay, and so now we're getting 403. We know that our auto loading is working, our namespaces are working. And so enums, they look like classes and they are fairly similar to classes in some of the things that they can do, but there are specific rules and things which you can do with classes but you can't do with enums. These need to be handled quite strictly in order for them to be effective. And so like I say, one of the things is you can't add properties, but there are also a few other things. For example, you can't instantiate them using the new keyword. There is no inheritance, so you can't extend one enum from another. And also, most of the magic methods, or the ones related to state at least, won't actually work. So there is a difference between enums and classes. Let's finish off with some serialization, I think. So in the previous chapter, we did serializing and unserializing objects. I just want to show you what a serialized enum looks like. And so here what I'm going to do is I'm going to say serialize response equals serialize response, and then we'll just dump this out. PHP Enums. Okay, so if you've not looked at serialized objects before, then this is what they look like. All of these things have meaning. So the big O here is 17. The O means that this is an object. So can you spot where the enum is amongst all of this? This is how enums are serialized. So I've got a capitalized E here, and then all the way up to there. That is what a serialized enum looks like. So maybe not as much information as you would have thought. You might have thought that it would serialize the actual integer value for this forbidden HTTP status code, but that doesn't happen. It just actually serializes sort of the name of the case. But let's unserialize it and see what happens. So I'm just using the built-in unserialized function, and then I'm dumping out the unserialized response. And the bit we're interested in is this, and this is the status code, as you can see, which is a HTTP status code enum, and you'll see that our value has come back. So what it has done is actually read the type of status code, seen that it is a forbidden, and it's just able to look at our HTTP status code enum and just grab the value from there and rebuild itself. So hopefully now you've got a good idea of what enums are and how they can be useful to you. Remember the definition which we said at the beginning. They provide a way to define a closed set of values for a type, and that's exactly how we've used them, to provide a closed set of values. Those closed set of values being HTTP status codes. We had a look at how you can grab the values for enums, how you can serialize them, how you can namespace, but also some of the limitations, such as you can't add properties to them or add magic methods which interfere with state, because we need to have strict values, strict meaning for enums. They are used to provide a strict set of values, and you don't want that to be interfered with or changed, or any values to come in which are outside of that closed circuit. If you like this lesson, then you'll love my object-oriented PHP course, which covers a lot of the stuff that you'll see in this video, such as composition, type hinting and serialization, as well as all the essentials of object-oriented programming in PHP. It's definitely going to help you, so I'll leave a link in the description and at the end of the video.